So I can see the participants coming in. We'll give it a few seconds until we have the bulk of them here, and then get us started. We have an exciting group today, so it's looking forward to the overall discussion. We were having a chat just before coming live, and I said this is a group that you would actually, while it's fun to do a podcast on this topic, it would actually be a good group to also go afterwards for something social. So this is next time we do this, it has to be live and then follow it with a social.
Sounds good. We'll take you up on that.
On board.
We'll bring Caroline from Montreal.
Absolutely. I'm there.
She always brings the party.
Well, and you know, coming out of the pandemic, we've learned to appreciate a bit more that sometimes we need a combination of the two. Although looking at some attendees, I know we have people coast to coast, so certainly the benefit it gives us is that we can actually reach people that would otherwise geography would otherwise impede from joining us.
100%.
Best of both worlds.
So I will get us started just for the in the interest of time, and I will probably repeat this a little bit later as well, just as since we have more people joining in. If you have any questions during the session, feel free to throw them in the chat. I will try to intertwine them during our discussion, or at the end, however, whichever one works best. Also, if this is approved for our professionalism half-hour EDI for any lawyers in the audience that need the hours, and it's both in Ontario and in BC. So I will repeat that again later on because I know it'll matter. And considering that just reset this, on January 1st, some of you will be keen to start getting the hours for this year. So on that note, I will actually start with introductions of our panelists, and then I'll go last, just in order of importance. So the panel is being more important, and I'll go last. Caroline, I will start with you, Bindu, and then Sandeep, just in the order that you appear in my screen. So Caroline, if you don't mind, a brief introduction.
Sure. I'm the president and founder of Women in Governance. It's an organization that helps companies that want to close the gender gap in the workplace, move the needle forward. And I'm deeply honored to be here. I'm part of a member of the advisory board of Alexa Translations. I sit on several boards, and my goal is to have more and more women on major boards.
Thank you, Caroline. And that makes you a perfect speaker for today. Bindu.
Hi, my name is Bindu Cudjoe. I'm currently the Chief Legal Officer, but relevant for this conversation, the Chief Inclusion and Equity Officer for Laurentian Bank of Canada. I have lived this experience for many years, and it's a real joy for me to be able to drive this work at Laurentian Bank. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation about how we create sustainable inclusiveness in our organizations. Over to you, Sandeep.
And I think Sandeep may be frozen for one moment. So if that is the case, then I'll quickly introduce myself while we refresh, as I suspected. So I'll quickly introduce myself as Sandeep joins us. My name is Gary Kalaci. I'm the CEO of Alexa Translations. And I was really excited to do this session today with an all-star panel. And I truly mean that because all three of our participants today you would have seen in a variety of contexts, whether speaking at conferences, on social media, etc., on a variety of the items that we'll be discussing today. So the true thought leaders in the space, and who best to bring here than the best thought leaders we could that we could find. So I will give Sandeep one more moment to join us, but just as a reminder of everyone that is actually on the attendees, I know a few more have joined us since last time. Feel free to throw in the chat any questions you may have, and ultimately we'll send an email following the event with the recording, as well as the CPD hours and how to claim them, because I see several lawyers in the audience, and I know you will want those CPD hours for Law Society purposes. And perhaps Caroline and Bindu, since we have a little bit of time, maybe like 30 seconds or sort of, and Caroline, if I'll start with you, and a bit of your sort of career path, because I think that's valuable to how that played out today as well. And then I'll ask Sandeep afterwards.
Ooh, she's back. Maybe we'll let Sandeep introduce herself, and then
We're pivoting live, which I like, and that's why I was not worried with the audience. So Sandeep, we did quick introductions, and I also went myself just to to keep us in order. So Sandeep, quick introduction, please.
Yeah, my apologies. I don't know what's going on with my internet connection, but I feel like we
all
could.
good.
But yeah, so I'm Sandeep Tatla. I'm the Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer at Fasken. I started my career a long time ago as a labor, employment, human rights lawyer, and pivoted close to almost 20 years ago now to really doing this kind of work focused on diversity and inclusion. And I've had the great privilege of being able to do this work globally across different geographies, different parts of the world, and across different industries. So financial services, private, public sector. I was talking to Carolyn about my time at PwC when we first met. So have seen a lot. So I've seen EDI go from something that's more compliance oriented to now really being part of a strong, sustainable business strategy. And I'm excited to have talk more about that today.
Oh, thank you very much, Sandeep. And Caroline, I know I asked a question. I'll come back to it a bit later. I think some of your historical background will be helpful, and we can intertwine it in some of the questions today, because I do want us to dive in, knowing that with this group we'll have a lot to cover, and the time will fly. So everyone in the audience, and far more broadly than our current participants today, we know that we hear a lot about ESG, EDI in our respective organizations and in the business community overall. But how do we make sure that every activity and every aspect of it forms part of our culture, of our organization's culture, as opposed to just something we talk about or that we feel like we kind of need to do, but not truly having instilled it in our organizations? And Bindu, if you don't mind, because as Sandeep joined us, you shuffled in my in my screen, so you'll go first if you don't mind, and I'll ask Caroline and Sandeep afterwards.
For sure. So I think this works. So first of all, I think EDI is actually is really the S and the G of ESG, not so much the environmental. And I think it's rightly so a topic of conversation across boardrooms and across our society. I think EDI has to be part of your strategy, because if it's not, then it's just window dressing, and it's something that you do to tick a box. It's compliance oriented, as Sandeep said, where we started. And so I think when you make something part of your strategy, you not only need to talk about it, but you need to measure it. You need to reflect on your performance, and you need to set goals to drive that. And I don't know that, like with any part of our strategy, like many strategies evolve. You may not be where you want to be. You set an aspiration for where you want to go. I think it's okay to start from an earlier space at a different place. I think when we talk about EDI, it is very much about where an organization is and its history and its story. I think geography is deeply relevant. And I think Sandeep, you could probably talk about this quite extensively. What does diversity look like in one country versus another is very, very different. So, I think to tackle, enhancing the inclusiveness, building an inclusive workplace and culture, you've got to look at who you are as an organization, and you have to make it part of your strategy, along with sales or membership or whatever it is that you're marking your success by. You have to factor that in and find ways to measure that. You can use lots of tools to do it, but it could also just generally be about like how you and your colleagues are feeling about being in the organization. So it's pretty simple. I think highly employees that feel and teams that feel really included, they deliver more. And it's just as selfish and simple as that. We spend most of our days working with people, working with our colleagues. And if you actually have an environment where you feel like you can contribute, you feel valued, you you'll always put a lot of passion into that. And I think that that drives business success. So I'm not certain why a company wouldn't want to make it part of it, and really happy to talk about ways to do that. So my opening foray. I don't know, Caroline.
Thank you, Bindu. Great start. And Caroline will continue with you. And I say the French way, but by the way, feel free to, she goes by Caroline or Caroline, so I don't think she will mind regardless.
Absolutely. You can call me Caro if you want also. So it's all good. It's all good. So thank you, Bindu. These were very important points that you were making. And yes, these EDI is the S and the G. I do believe the E is extremely important as well, because all the work that I do and my team does to ensure there's, you know, a real balance, there's gender equity, there's parity, is kind of meaningless if we have no planet to be equal on. So I'm personally also very vested on the E. Through, I was mentioning the boards that I sit on. I also sit on the board of Aricor, which is the Australian Renewable Energy Corporation, and they do a lot of work with underwater turbines. I'm very proud of the work that we've been doing here in Montreal and in Sydney. Anyway, to go back to really the core of the EDI, what we were saying, you know, I fully concur that what gets measured gets done. And I think one of the biggest issues we have is that companies often will use hashtags and pledges, they will say things. And then when you scratch the surface, you realize that they're just buzzwords that they've been using. There's a lot of performative action, well, not even action, performative, whatever you want to call it. And to me, it's essential that, first of all, organizations understand where they stand on the gender parity spectrum, on the equity spectrum. And if you are serious about wanting to close a gap, whatever gap it is you're trying to close, well, you need to understand its magnitude, its root causes, and it's, you know, it's the magnitude, the causes, and where exactly these gaps are within the organizations. Otherwise, you're going at it blindly. And it's easy to, on March 8th, to be tweeting at, you know, at ABC Inc. or XYZ Inc., we're so proud and we're doing this. But at the end of the day, first of all, do you know exactly where you stand? And second of all, what are you actually doing to bridge that gap? And, you know, that'll be my few seconds of publicity here, talking about the parity certification that we've developed at Women in Governance, where we've got this year 91 organizations have gone through this, major companies that are actually wanting to understand where they stand, but they also want to measure year after year and see how they progress. Because the way I see it, you know, gender equity is like driving a car in an uphill, and the minute you take your foot off the gas pedal, you're actually moving backwards. And we've seen it during the pandemic. The women were the first ones to be, you know, disproportionately impacted, whether they left the workforce because they couldn't handle the work-life at home balance, or whether they lost their jobs. The truth of the matter, we are the first ones that are going to lose our rights, that are going to lose our privileges. So we need to keep at it in a very constant fashion. Last word I want to say about the certification, we've reached the very important threshold of 1 million employees working in a company that has our certification in Canada and the US. And we will, we're waiting for a date, but we're going to be opening the stock markets with that announcement soon. So voila, that's, I have a lot more to say, but I know Sandeep is going to also enlighten us with her comments. So I don't want to take too much time.
No, and we'll make sure Caroline to do the rounds a few times. So Sandeep, please.
Oh no, she froze again. But you know, every time she freezes, she looks lovely. You know, sometimes you freeze like this, but she's just
yeah, well, that never happens to me. Every time I freeze, it looks like something bad happened. It's like something must have happened to Gary that was trash, because he looks horrible. Never as gracious as Sandeep. So, but the Caroline, one of the things I asked earlier, and I'll use this opportunity right now. It's certainly you were on the corporate life before, and then obviously this started for you as a not-for-profit side project before it became something you did for a living. So tell us a little bit about that path, because there may be people in the audience that have aspirations to do things that truly move the needle around this well beyond their respective corporations.
Well, I'm going to say something that's very cliche, and that is, I should have done this so much sooner. I mean, every time somebody starts a project that they love, or an entrepreneur starts their business, but at the end of the day, you do it when you actually feel the timing is right. And probably if you had done it sooner, the timing wouldn't have been right. So yes, I spent 25 years in the corporate world. I had a lot of senior executive roles. And in my last job, I was executive vice president of one of Canada's largest medical expertise firms, reporting to an all-male pale stale board. And I had this sort of side project, which was women in governance. And the work that we were doing was really with the women, supporting the women, mentoring the women, training the women, governance training, etc. Until we realized the women would go back into workplaces that had traditionally been built by men for men. And they were frustrated because there were other obstacles that they couldn't overcome. And then we thought, okay, it's not the women that needs to be fixed. It is really the workplace culture. It is really the policies. We need to help organizations understand what type of initiatives they can put in place that are actually going to give women a fair chance of advancement. Because it is not true that women are less ambitious. It is not true that women are not, just as, or maybe they are more educated, quite frankly, because it is 60% of university graduates. But 51% of the population, 60% of university graduates, 80% of buying decision-making, yet they hold about a quarter of board seats, and they're about 5% of CEOs of the FP 500. So it's completely disconnected. And it is not true that it is, because the women, they don't, they lack confidence, or the women, they don't raise their hand, or this, that. Some of it might be true, but not to the extent that 5% of women are women and 95% are men. So there's definitely work that needs to be done for organizations to better understand how they can offer an inclusive workplace culture that is in their interest. Because at the end of the day, when we know it, I think we're beyond the why are we doing this. We're more around the how to do this. But just a quick note, Bindu touched upon that. I mean, more diversity equals better employee engagement, equals more innovation, equals more different perspectives, ideas that come to the table, more robust decision-making. And at the end of the day, that's going to impact the bottom line. You're going to make more money. You're going to penetrate more markets. You're going to create more products or services. And it's anybody who doesn't get this, and a lot of organizations don't get this today, because there's about, I think, more than 20% of publicly traded companies in Canada that don't have one woman on their board. We're not even talking about how far are we to reach the parity zone, which is 40-60. We're at 100% men, 0% women. So that still exists to this day. There are people that we need still to send all those McKinsey reports and Mercer and Accenture and Willis Towers Watson reports that all say the same thing, just to have them convinced.
And Sandeep, I asked Caroline briefly just around starting women in governance and what that path looked like as you dropped, because I thought that was an important story for the audience to be aware of, especially if any of them have aspirations to do things that are initiatives, more entrepreneurial initiatives in that context. But Sandeep, I'll go back to the original question for you. So how do we make it part of our culture? How do we make it more than just an initiative that we feel like we need to do because this is what the direction of corporate life is, but rather something that matters and instilled as part of our culture?
Oh,
No way.
Well, I'll blame it on our Zoom, because it's
This is next level.
And I think
same.
like I said, every time as you pinpointed,
She's about to talk. Oh my gosh.
but every time she's always caught in a.
She is
I think she's planning this.
That's true. Maybe.
She strikes a pose and she remains silent. Maybe she's here. Maybe she hears us.
Well, Bindu, I will, and I'll go back to Sandeep with this, but something I wanted to ask you in the meantime
Can I
is,
make a quick recommendation?
please,
Can someone from the
please.
team call Sandeep and ask her to join us even through the phone? Forget the camera and we can at least hear her remarks. I'm sure she has
Of
a lot to
course.
bring to the conversation.
No,
Absolutely.
we'll sort it out, and we'll lean a bit heavier on her later in the discussion as well. But just because some of these are so they tie in together very very well. So
Great.
one of the things that I wanted to ask you, Bindu, is let's say I am an in-house counsel. Let's say I didn't go the entrepreneurial route and decided to stay in law in the traditional sense. I'm in-house counsel, and I
Yep.
was given as part of my responsibilities to be in charge of ESG and DI initiatives within the organization. And I'm passionate about it. I like it. I don't know too much about it. I've learned sort of from some webinars, etc., but I haven't spent a lot of time exploring it. How do I go about doing it? Like, what are some tips that you could give me to say, here's how you tackle it, here's how you triage sort of what you can handle first and what you could do later on. Because I know many people in the audience will be in that sort of at various levels within their organization. Some will be very advanced, but some will be early stages. And I think it's important at any stage.
Great question. I'd say, first of all, there's probably nobody who's actually an expert in this space. So whether it's your lived experience or whether this is just something that you're a really passionate learner about, um, there you can start from zero and certainly get to being able to speak coherently about the topic. So don't let that intimidate you, because I think there is sometimes a feeling like you can't do this work unless you have that lived experience. And lived experience, of course, is super important, but it's not where it stops, and it's not where it starts or stops. And then I'd say, secondly, in terms of how do you bring this work to your organization? I think it actually does start with a bit of a baseline, right? Where is your organization right now, and what are they ready for? Because some of the conversations that we're having now are conversations that started 20 years ago. Back when I was in private practice, back in my first in-house opportunities, and to see the progression of the discussion over the years is heartening and somewhat disheartening, because it seems to be like we still sometimes have to talk about the business case for why we're doing this. But sometimes the stuff that we're talking about right now, like I was just part of a webinar where we were talking about allyship, but just importantly, privilege. Privilege can be a hard topic to tackle. And if you haven't done some of the work or some of the learning, or had your organization come along the way to understand that, recognizing your own privilege is not necessarily something you have to feel bad about, but rather to recognize that it's something that you have that others may not, and how that can benefit you or not. It takes some time. So I would say you have to sort of really take a hard look at where your organization is, imbue it in kind of the life of the organization, whether that's through strategy, which I think it should be, from having senior leaders also talk about this and reinforce it and live it. So not just talk about it, to Caroline's point about it being performative and hashtagging this and changing the corporate logo to include rainbow colors once a year. You've got to live it, and then you have to measure yourself against it. And I think where you choose to play is going to be very much driven by the organization that you're in. And I don't think it's a failure if an organization can't do everything all at once, because nobody can, right? So start with the things that are the most important to your organization. If that is turning the culture around, creating an inclusive work environment where people feel like they can share their perspectives, share who they are, well, that's an important starting point. I don't want to diminish that. But it may look a little different in another organization who can tie this strategy into how we're pursuing customers, or how we're engaging with customers, or work that we're doing in the community. And so I think you have to take your cues from your organization, not and start where they are, and set aspirations that are meaningful and somewhat achievable, because nobody really succeeds at things that they never ever can get to. So, and I think with every bit of success, there might be a few setbacks, but then it helps you set the bar a little bit further and to go a little bit a little more ambitious. And so I think it's iterative. This is not one strategy fits all for every organization. And here's the roadmap. And if you don't stick to it, then you're a failure. That's not it at all, right? This is one of those things where you've got to see. I think the pandemic both advanced and rolled back some of the advancements around EDI. I think us all being cloistered in our houses caused us to be a little bit more open to the world, but also then caused us to be a little bit more closed about some things in the world, right? So it's, I think we have to balance what our plans are with the environment that we're in. And Sandeep seems to be alive and moving on the screen, so I think we should get her to talk right now about anything that she wants while she's still there.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on. It seems like there's something, but I will talk really quickly and then try to dial in. I'm having some issues there too. Is that okay? I'd love to answer
the feel free, yeah.
Strategy and making it sustainable. So I think what Caroline said about the performative piece is right. I also think there's a misnomer that diversity is just about something that HR or the people functions need to worry about.
Yeah.
See it a lot of times in HR strategy, but rather you don't see it in the broader organizational strategy. And where it actually belongs is it should be part of that organizational strategy. It should be an enabler of all the goals that you've set out for your organization. And you should be thinking about how can diversity actually help you achieve those goals. And from what I heard while I was on the call, I mean, we've talked about the culture piece, we've talked about the relationships people have with each other. And obviously that's an enabler in and of itself. But there's also other things that, are happening. We know demographics generally are changing. Stats came out with some research saying, in 2041, at least 42% of the population is going to be racialized or, what we call visible minority. That's huge. So think about the diversity of that population. And then if you also look at, so if you just think about that, how are you going to market, right? What does your marketing look like? What are the products that you're developing? How do you have to change the services that you provide? Those are all decisions made in other business lines, not in HR, not in people. Those are, so it needs to be integrated across those pillars. And then even, in the legal world, a lot of the times we're a relationship-based business. You need to know how to build relationships, and the go-to and the comfort for most of us, and the research shows, is our biases are that it's easier to make relationships with those that are similar to us. That is not going to be the world for any of us, right? As we go into the next 10, 15 years. So you've got to learn how to make relationships and create trust across difference, both as individuals, but broader, if you like, with your consumers, right? And I think what I heard on the tail end of what Bindu said is there is lots changing in customer expectations around diversity are significantly changing it. And that's because they're seeing diversity in their own lives. They're seeing the value of it in their own lives. And when they don't see it coming from organizations that they're working in or with, they just don't have the patience for it. They're like, if I can figure it out in my own world, why can't you figure it out? So it's you got to be careful that you don't just stick diversity in HR and think that it's going to be there. It actually, a solid strategy needs to make sure that it's across all of the pillars of the business, and that there's accountability and people are thinking about it. A really brief example, it was so interesting over the summer. I was talking to someone in the US who works at a pharmaceutical company. They were doing their go-to-market strategy for this pain reliever, quite popular. And no one had actually looked at the demographics of the users, which I thought would, maybe traditional demographics like income, whatever, but they didn't look at sort of racial demographics. And when this individual, who happened to be diverse and on this team, raised that, they did it, and they realized that their largest users were African Americans, and that then really pivoted their whole go-to-market strategy. So these are the kinds of things. So you need diversity on your team so that they can bring these wonderful ideas to you, but that shouldn't be your proxy. You shouldn't be waiting for that diverse person to say, here's an idea. you should, like, people should be thinking about those issues as they're, going to market. So it should be integrated. And that's really what, when you see the stats around diversity leads to better business results, that's how it actually sort of starts to come into play.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I can add something to what Sandeep was saying is, and I think it illustrates well, there's inclusion and there's diversity. So diversity is just a fact, right? We are diverse. There's diversity everywhere we look, but that doesn't mean an organization that has a lot of diverse people doesn't mean it's an inclusive culture, and that makes a
100%.
world of a difference. When I came here 30 years ago, I was told, well, you need to fit. Well, what does that mean, fit? I've had my own experiences. I grew up through the Lebanese Civil War. I don't have your experience of I don't know, growing up in Brossard maybe. And so why do you not recognize that I may be bringing something to the table that you don't have? And that is actually a value. So you're actually diminishing my value by asking me to fit in your square, instead of saying, well, whatever I'm paying her, let me actually leverage it, because not only is she bringing me this or that expertise, but she's also bringing me a life of experiences that I don't have. And so together, that complementarity of talent is just going to make us stronger. And our clients, as both Bindu and Sandeep were mentioning, they want to see, like, I mean, at Fasken, if you just show up to see a client who's maybe a Black woman who's the CEO of a company looking for a lawyer, and 5 white men show up, she may not want to give the contract. Not that she's looking for 5 Black women to show up, but she's looking to just say, okay, well, are we going to understand each other? Do you value the fact that we are different, but we have our own value, our own something to bring to the table that's different? So I always encourage organizations to recognize the different nationalities that are around the table, the different sexual orientations, different religions, whatever it is, as a plus for the organization, and not a lack of cohesion or trying to all look alike. Yes. That we've evolved so much over the past couple of decades, which is in the favor of diverse people.
Absolutely. And if I could just jump in with one more point. I mean, I think as a business strategy, very few businesses decide that the way to go is to only focus on one customer, one client, one segment, right? Everyone talks about diversification. So if you think about that, how can one justify a homogenous leadership team, a homogenous board, a homogenous, workforce, right? We don't. We actively pursue the diversity of that. So what's the point of the diversity, to Caroline's point, if we don't actually bring it to life and give it room to kind of, for the ideas to surface, for different points of views, for there to be challenge, but also agreement, and just to bring different ideas. And they may come out of the most surprising places, right? So on the surface, you may think somebody is diverse on one level or another, but there's all the other stuff, all the other things that may not be self-evident or evident to people that can often be the differentiators, right? The fact that I grew up in a lower middle class family or lower income family, or that I grew up in this neighborhood, or that I grew up in a rural community, or that I practice a faith that is very very much a minority in this, like, all of those things will bring a different lens. And so I think when we just talk about diversity, that is just the start, but it can't be the end of the conversation. And instead of justifying diversity, I think we might have to explain homogeneity, right? So if we all look the same, and that would be the same, like me, Sandeep, and 4 other brown girls doing something, we might have to explain ourselves too, right? Like, why? Now, we might be trying to disrupt the status quo, which we may or may not be doing, but I think we have to think about the benefit that comes from all of us bringing our different experiences, lived and otherwise, professional trainings, to bear on an organization, and how we can make it better.
Yeah. And it's funny because I was, well, funny or not funny, but I was having a conversation with a French man who was living in Toronto for 2 years, just moved to Montreal recently. He's a Black man with an African name that is not easy to pronounce. And he said, I don't understand. I've been trying to find a job, and he's very qualified. Been trying to find a job in Quebec for a few months, and they're not calling me back. And, could it be there's racism? I said, well, could it be there's racism? A little bit. And he felt less of that in Toronto than here in Quebec, which I find quite sad. And he said, but you're lucky because when people see you, they have no idea that you're an Arab woman, that you've got this name, who knows where you're from, you've got these features, who knows where you're from. And so my brother, his name is Nabil, and my parents chose a very Western name for me. And when he sends a CV, people know right away, okay, Nabil Codsi, okay, where is this guy from? It's probably an Arabic name. And those who will see my name, only the Arabs will actually know that my name is an Arabic name, because Codsi means from Jerusalem. In Arabic, Jerusalem is Al-Quds, and so Codsi is from Jerusalem. So I do kind of feel a bit of privilege in the sense that for a long time, when people did not know as much of my personal story and I wasn't a public figure, I kind of surfed on the wave of who knows where I'm from. And I think it's sad to say, but I think that it probably helped me at one point in my career. So I really find that when organizations are looking at CVs, it's so much better when they do it blindly, when you don't see the gender, when you don't see the name. And even those of us who will say, oh, but I don't have any bias. Well, we all do. I know I have bias. I catch myself on a regular basis, let's face it. And it's a reality. There's this orchestra that had decided that they were no longer going to get the auditions to be done in front of the judges, but behind curtains, so that they could increase the number of women on the part of the orchestra. And then they realized, it was getting better, but wasn't material. And then they added behind the curtains, they added a carpet from backstage to the piano or to wherever they had to be, so they don't hear the click of the heels and be able to tell whether that was actually a woman or not. So this is the level of bias, and nobody's mean or a bad person. It's ingrained, and we need to do a lot of work for this unconscious bias to become conscious and to stop.
Absolutely.
And we've had some great thoughts shared, and certainly talked about things we can do to make it part of our culture within the organizations. And one question that we had talked a bit about in advance, and it actually came up in one of the Q&As from the audience as well, is how do we measure it? And how do we really, and Sandeep, I'll start with you, but really and I'll paint the picture a little bit. Even shareholders are telling organizations that are publicly traded is, I want you to really show me what you're doing on the ESG front. Let's not just, to Bindu's point, change the logo and do sort of window dressing, but show me some metrics, show me some KPIs around how you're actually practically doing it. So what are some suggestions, and perhaps Sandeep, we'll go with Sandeep, Bindu, and then Caroline, just in terms of things that organizations can do, what the triage process looks like, what are the low-hanging fruit to start with, and prove to the organizations, here's what it did, and in order to tackle bigger initiatives. So just some thoughts on this, I think, would be very helpful to the audience.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I am of two sort of sides of this. I think there are some standard metrics that I think we want to start to benchmark, and I think Carolyn can talk about what she's done with women in governance around representation at certain levels. And I think that becomes a benchmark that investors and others can, track to, right? So I'm going to leave some of that discussion probably both to Bindu and Carolyn. But what I do want to talk more specifically internally in your organization, how you should be thinking about the metrics so that you've got a sustainable strategy to track, are you actually making change? And then you can decide how, once you've got a good rhythm on that, what you want to share more publicly. But if you go back to, I've said EDI should be an enabler of your corporate whatever your business strategy is. So you probably have metrics that are really important to you, generally, that your CEO or your some of your more senior leaders are looking at on a regular basis. Think about what metrics might enable that, right? So if you are looking at your teams and you want to ensure that there is diversity on your teams, generally you start at a leadership level and you'd want to make sure that those leadership teams look diverse. So just looking at representation itself is probably not it'll help, it'll let you know where you're at. But what I really push, those business line leaders or others to really look at is look at your attrition rate, look at your hire rates. Who are you hiring? Who are you not hiring? Who's leaving your organization or not? And actually, don't just do it at the top level, do it with those different business lines, because those conversations then are more tangible. Because if there's a problem with your culture and you have a certain segment of population that's continually leaving, you got to ask yourself what's going on there, right? Or, you track where, I've gone granular enough to track things like, are we actually bringing in, are people applying to our roles that are diverse, or are we missing the mark somewhere? And then once they apply, when they go through the funnel, where are they dropping off, right? And so if they're dropping off at certain parts, right, if it's not through HR, maybe we've done a fantastic job, because like I said, we do a really good job of focusing on HR. HR has done a really good job of screening the candidates and giving you a diverse slate, but then when it gets to the hiring manager, everything falls apart. You then know, oh, we got to work on that group and figure out what training, what awareness they need to recognize the biases that are coming into play. So metrics and goals, can work really well to help change behavior. But just like anything else that you do on your business line that you track, you got to put that same rigor onto it. The one caveat I would say is communication around EDI goals or aspirations is critical, because the last thing you want is some leader thinking, I have to hire a woman, that like I just don't have a choice, because that's going to backfire from a culture perspective. That candidate's not going to be successful because people are going to think they're only in that role because you had to hire a woman. So, I found when you're working on the metrics and trying to create equity around those, what I call talent rates, like higher promotion, when you start to say that's what you're focused on, creating equity there, it's a different conversation than saying, you have to hit this goal of representation and people feel that strong-armed into hiring a particular group.
Thank you, Sandeep. Very, very, very important insights. Bindu.
Yeah, I would pick up on what Sandeep said is the why of what we're doing. So even as you're trying to understand who your organization is and you're using surveys or otherwise to have people self-identify, they want to understand why. And I think the pendulum has swung so far that people feel like they might be penalized. I'm constantly surprised at the number of white men who would like to tell me that they're extremely hard done by this new wave of focus on inclusion and diversity. And I get it. Like, I think people are feeling displaced. They are wondering. I think people, women, people of color are sometimes, insecure to feel like maybe I'm only getting a phone call or getting a nod because I'm ticking these boxes. So it cuts all ways, right? Some people will feel like they're being cut out of opportunities, and others will feel that maybe they're only being considered for opportunities because of that. So I think the why we're doing this and what this is going to look like for not maybe just the organization, but also deeper into the group, I think is really deeply important. Our organization introduced metrics that we report to the street around, baselining, like here's where we are, here's what our goals are, and we measure ourselves up against that. There's absolutely a little bit of discomfort in saying, well, here's where we are, because everybody assumes everybody else is better, but turns out probably not the fact. But taking those aggregate bank numbers really doesn't tell the story of what's happening in the organization, right? So different groups have different compositions. And I can speak from my own group. I have a lot of senior women in senior roles, and I have a lot of diversity in my group. But when you start to aggregate those numbers across the bank, my group is small, but maybe that's driven by training, by me, by biases that I have in hiring, or maybe it's just sort of who's attracted to these roles. But when you have to measure it across the organization, so every business line, every function, they're going to have different challenges. Some challenges it's to attract women, some it's to attract people of, like racialized people. Some it's who knows what it's going to be, right? And or you may have groups that are heavily female, and maybe what your diversity challenge is, your inclusion challenge is to make sure that you've created a place that's comfortable for men to want to be there. So I think you've got to, I think the outward looking setting goals is really important because, again, I think that we are all held to sort of measure that and meet that. But I think it's just as important, to Sandeep's point, that you're looking layers down, right? So you're looking at, what are the specific challenges, and talking to the leaders, like, why is that, right? I'm not going to make an assumption that, you're a racist or you're, like, biased again. Like, why is this a challenge in your group? And let's talk about it, and let's work on strategies to address it. I absolutely think that there's equity that you can introduce into more standardized processes, but that equity then we have to sort of test it, and we need some some compliance like activity to kind of push around that, right? So that's great. You have this pipeline that's coming in, but they're not getting hired, or they're getting hired and then they're leaving, or they're getting hired but they're paid disproportionately differently from other people in the group. And is that just because they're new, or is it for some other reason? But having the courage to have those conversations, I think that goes back to communication. It goes back to creating like a conversation, a culture of being able to have those hard discussions, and to, I think, also create like enough education and knowledge that those conversations don't stop and start in making people feel really badly about where their organization's at or where their group is at, and empowering people to sort of say, well, here's how we can work on this together. Here's how we can fix it. Here's how we can address that. So I don't think it is just to have public metrics and tick boxes, but I think you have to be, talking to leaders. You have to be talking to the workforce, and whether you get that intelligence through voice of the employee surveys or ethics programs, the kinds of complaints that most people complain about unfairness, right? Like, that's what they're fundamentally complaining about, that something is unfair. So what are you doing with those complaints? And are you acting on them? Are you looking into them? Or are you just treating them like they're grievances of some disgruntled employee or otherwise? So I think it's got to be multifaceted, and the KPIs, they've got to be relevant for your organization. Like, how do you drive sales? If you're a sales organization, how do you drive sales? Well, what tactics are you using there? Can you use those same tactics to drive, inclusion in your organization? Or maybe you need to try something different.
No, thank you, Bindu. Incredibly powerful thoughts, and I think they will really resonate. Caroline.
So I fully agree with what both of you have said tenfold. I think that all the work that is ever done needs to be done at every level of the organization. So when we're looking at what do we do to attract, to retain, to fairly compensate, to promote, to mentor, what is the turnover, et cetera, we need to look at every level, because we need to make sure that there's a healthy pipeline of female talent within the organization. The other day, I met this man who's the CEO of a fairly large organization, who said, oh, I wanted to meet you. I've got 50% of women in my organization. It's so exciting. And I said, yay, good for you. So you've got gender parity on your board of directors. He said, yeah, no, not at the board. I said, okay, well, then your executive committee. Yeah, no, not there either. I said, okay, well, I mean, where exactly? He says, well, overall. I said, no, but you cannot measure it like that. You cannot take 1,000 employees and say 500 are women, but they're all the 500 at the bottom are women, and the 500, and it boggled my mind that to this, day and age, there's still people who actually get excited about the wrong metrics. So you have to measure it in a smart way so that you can have an impact. You can have an effect on these numbers. But when you're just high-fiving each other with the VP of HR and the CFO and the board saying, yay, we've got half, and those that are high-fiving themselves, they're all the white men. It's crazy. But I also want to echo one of the comment that was said about, if we have to hire a woman, or we have to hire an Indigenous person, et cetera. That is really not the way to go. I've always said that gender parity zone is what's important, which is 40-60. So if a man leaves, I don't have to replace him by a man. And if a woman leaves, doesn't have to be replaced by a woman necessarily. We need to have that flexibility. And we also need to make sure to echo, I believe it's Bindu who mentioned that the female-dominated environments are not better, because what we are aiming for is a complementarity of talents. And I always tell women who are in female-dominated environments and are complaining about the salaries, I say, well, try to attract men and they will do what they have to do to ensure that the salaries go up. And here in Quebec, you may have followed, there have been lots of strikes because the teachers were underpaid, because the daycare workers were underpaid, because the nurses were underpaid. But the policemen, well, police forces, I shouldn't say men because there's a lot of women, but still there's more men. The police forces, the fire people, the MPs got massive raises. So, I think that says it all. And one last point is about the getting a nod because you're a woman, or getting, selected because you're a person of color. Listen, for decades, you were not selected because you were a woman. You were disregarded because you were a person of color. If that gives you an edge, by all means, go for it, because nobody's going to choose a woman who's incompetent or a person of color who's incompetent. They're going to choose someone who's got all and even more, because trust me, I get calls all the time. We're looking for a woman for our board. She needs to have this, that. And I'm like, is there one man on your board that has half of all of this? No, you're looking for someone who doesn't exist just because it's a woman. That makes no sense. So if they're tapping you on the shoulder, believe in yourself. Believe that you've got the qualifications, the education, the you've got everything that it takes. And so they're giving you a crack at it. Go prove yourself. Listen, you want to nominate me because I'm a Lebanese woman? And I'm going to prove you all that I can bring to your board once I'm there. Just give me a chance. So, voila.
And Caroline, on that last point, we did a podcast where Caroline talked about the imposter syndrome and how to overcome it for women and otherwise. But it's just, I think it's an important piece and may help bridge the gap in some of the situations.
Sure.
But I think the metrics are important. I think really having ways to show progress is important, and both internally, shareholders, otherwise stakeholders involved. One question that we had contemplated, and interestingly enough, also brought up by the audience, Brian asked, what are some of the common missteps taken by organizations when trying to implement and integrate diversity strategies? And for example, what might create more resistance from dominant groups than be helpful, for example? And I know we've touched on some of this already, and feel free, any of you, to jump in. I think it's an important point, is that sometimes we may need to pivot from how we started initially, because we may have some of the steps we took may not be ideal in terms of getting to the goal that we're looking for.
I think Sandeep touched on that. Maybe you want to.
Well, I mean, I think one of them is with how you manage the goals. So that is critical, and how you, when you set them, how you socialize them, how you use them. So those can back. For sure. I think I touched on that. But the one that I was thinking about when I sort of heard you talking, and I've talked about it a lot, especially recently with what we've been seeing coming out of the US with sort of this attack on diversity. I think like a common misconception, and I think it's incumbent on EDI leaders within organizations to clarify, diversity, like workplace or corporate workplace diversity, is not social justice like we see on sort of outside our doors. There's definitely, if there's a Venn diagram, there is this intersection that happens. So there is that. But I think a lot of people within organizations get confused, right? And they think that when you're pushing diversity and inclusion forward, it's all of the dialogue that's happening outside our doors is what's now inside our doors. And I think, grounding it back on why this is good for the business, and going back to embedding into your strategy, knowing the business case, knowing what you're using the data for and why, like all of that can bring people back to like, no, okay, I get, like, this isn't just this organization being woke and jumping on whatever sort of
bandwagon
of the day. Yeah, right. This is like required for us to be here in the next 10, 15, 20 years. This is why it's under the sustainability banner. This isn't, so I think going back to that, and I think it's incumbent on those who are trying to champion diversity for themselves too, to really anchor themselves in that. because then that noise, I mean, sometimes I'm tired, like I turn on the radio, it's on the radio, and I'm like, oh my God, it's too much diversity. You got to remember what we're trying to do here, right? There is some real issues around how people work together, creating safety for each other, ensuring that, you're able to deliver on whatever you as an organization need to meet the needs of your stakeholders. Those are real issues. And if you're not managing diversity well, things are going to go sideways quickly.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
those are actually low-hanging fruit to tackle as well, like, safety, like to really talk about safety in the workplace, not strictly in the physical sense, but just emotionally, etc. Like what a great component that no one could argue with. It's like, how could you ever not want your any of your team members to ever feel different? So that's um, and as I suspected with this group, I knew we were going to run out of time before getting anywhere close to all the questions. But short of any further thoughts from Bindu or Caroline on that particular item, what I wanted to do is sort of give you an opportunity on any sort of, we're in the last 3 minutes now of the webinar, to take a minute and say, what are some parting thoughts that you'd leave the audience with in terms of things they could do more immediately, or tips that you've seen work well? Any last minute thoughts that we didn't get a chance to address during the webinar so far? And Caroline, if I may, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I'm obviously going to encourage people to look up our parity certification.
It's low-hanging fruit. It's
Well, I mean, this is probably the fastest path if you want to accelerate wherever you stand. And so we've got some platinum organizations that are just unbelievable and that we're showcasing as, doing all the best practices and having all the right initiatives in place, and yay. But then we've got the majority that are bronze, maybe silver, and we tremendously appreciate organizations that come to us and they go, this is going to be very hard. We're very male dominated, and we have a ton of very male dominated, the Bombardiers and the Rolls Royce of this world. And, there's so many organizations that feel that they cannot do this. So they'd rather, not do anything, which is wrong, because everybody can do something. And there's, for instance, Cooper Equipment, they struggled tremendously for the first couple of years, finally starting to get results. And I'm not sharing anything that they don't talk about themselves. And the fact of the matter is, when they see that they become a more attractive workplace for women, that they are implementing easy strategies that they probably, maybe it would have taken them 5 years to get to, but having done the certification once and getting that very detailed report that we work on with Mercer, Accenture, Willis Towers Watson, I mean, it's very solid, that gives them a clear roadmap of what they need to do. And again, it could be overwhelming, because if you're part of these organizations that are, maybe not at the top of the barrel, you may find, okay, well, how am I going to do all this? Well, there's priorities to be said. There's ways to communicate to your employees, which increases tremendously the engagement, because when you tell your employees that we know, we see it, instead of just congratulating yourself and saying, yeah, it's March 8th and blah, 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 but you're saying that you're actually doing the work and with an external third party. And I don't want to take up more time, but I just obviously wanted to share that. And to those who are concerned about the fact that, maybe there's a bit of not domination, but there's, more and more conversations about women and members of underrepresented groups. I want to say that the rights of these people, it doesn't take anything away from you. It's not pie. There's enough to go around. So be reassured.
Thank you, Caroline. Bindu.
Obviously echoing what Caroline has to say, I think I would say this work won't happen without deliberate, systematic effort. So you cannot wish it into existence, right? It does take work. It does take time. There will be steps forward. There will be steps back. Don't be discouraged. But if this is aligned to the values of your organization, which should be aligned to the strategy of your organization, it can happen. And it will be just like increasing your sales or whatever it is that you set out to do as an organization. So put the time and the energy to it, and it is worth it. Because, Sandeep, you said something about places not feeling, or places being safe to people. And I think that's where, when we talk about perhaps the majority or the former power, they're feeling unsafe. But just imagine how your workplace has felt for everybody else. It hasn't felt comfortable. It hasn't felt safe. So what would happen to as a society, as an organization, or otherwise, if everybody felt like they had a place and ways to contribute? So along with that, as you make these changes, you have to back it up with supports. So appointing the first, whatever that person is, if you don't support them, train them, orient them, mentor them, coach them, they're going to fail. Because being the first and having your head poked through the ceiling is a scary place. You don't quite know what's around you, right? And so be deliberate, be patient, but not too patient, be a little bit impatient. But then, and have built the supports around it, I think, are really important.
Thank you, Bindu. And Sandeep, last minute thoughts on weekend.
Yeah, I mean, both of them have said some really great things. I think what I would say is this is a journey, and I think I echo what Bindu said, like there's going to be start stops. It is also can sometimes be overwhelming. It seems like there's so much you can do, and you're like, oh, I gotta fix this, gotta do this. So what I say is just like pick 3 things is this year that you want to do.
Wow.
Like focus on them, and just get those done instead of trying to boil the ocean. And those 3 things you pick should be issues that you're actually having. Like don't go look at what your competitors are doing, or what, like look inside your organization and be like, what have we heard, right? What kind of complaints are coming through? What does our data tell us, right? And that's why Women in Governance is good. It gives you a report on here's where your issues are. So like maybe that's the first step. Figure out where your actual issues are. Where can you make the biggest impact? Where's your low-hanging fruit?
Yeah.
And like, I know people always that's still a lot of work, but where I always say is if your organization hasn't really been doing a lot of work, start raising awareness, right? So start there, right? Because that is a foundational piece around what is EDI? What are you trying to accomplish? Some basic trainings on like, allyship, like just start even there, just to like get the more people that understand what EDI actually is, the more you're going to have people who want to help and figure this out for you. So it's not just you and the few people that feel like this is important. So I'll leave it there. And also it is tremendous when you can start to see shifts happening and you can actually realize that, going back to Bindu's, you've actually shifted something for someone. And these shifts are actually so important for not only the person's professional well-being, but their overall well-being. And research actually shows the well-being of their family. So this work is, really important fundamentally to us, and our overall well-being.
Well, thank you all for the time. I really appreciate it. I think the audience found it particularly helpful. And as I suspected, we're probably going to need an encore of this with an in-person social to follow. Thank you again for your time. Great to see all of you. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us for a few extra minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.